Thank you for holding on till the bitter end. Your reward will be to be told where the drinks are, but not yet. Moral analysis is simply an attempt to assess the relative importance of things that reasonable people care about. This will be one quick example. It's urgent to hold the temperature rise to as close as possible to 1.5, mainly to minimize the number of tipping points, points of no return, like the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet, that we force the climate system to pass, lest we unnecessarily saddle future generations with crushing burdens. And it's urgent to maintain and enhance the momentum of efforts to lift from current generations the already crushing burdens of poverty that blight the only lives that these fellow humans are ever going to have. It would be outrageous to attempt to slow the pace of the escape from malnutrition and drudgery as a means of reserving more of the remaining carbon budget for the indulgence of our own optional preferences, that is, to constrain subsistence emissions in order to preserve luxury emissions. The challenging question is how to think about the relationship between these two separately compelling concerns, ending climate disruption and ending grinding poverty. We could, first, try to come as close as possible to respecting each, while more or less equally respecting the other. To make that less abstract with an artificial example, one could say do 85% of what will be necessary in order to keep the temperature rise to 1.5, in order to also do 85% of what would be necessary in order to allow the poorest to escape poverty. 2 points about that approach. First, this would be disastrous because it would mean that neither constraint would be fully honored. In each case, it would be close but no cigar. Second, this is where we're probably headed. The attitude now seems to be to do the best we can for each consideration while compromising it enough to avoid having to compromise the other consideration any more than we're compromising the first. This is one manner in which political compromise regularly goes wrong. Equal compromise leading to equal inadequacy. Call this approach the double compromise, which I think would surely lead to double disaster, too much climate change and too little poverty eradication. So a second approach would be to compromise one of the two considerations enough to honor the other one fully. Call this the single compromise. But 2 points can be immediately made about this possibility. First, it's off the table politically. Neither the leading developed nor the leading developing countries will willingly sacrifice their first priority. And as everyone knows, they each respectively have opposite priorities. Second, it would in any case be deeply unreasonable because each consideration is overwhelmingly important. There's no good reason to make one of them secondary to the other. So what we have to do is innovate approaches that respect both these considerations as fully as possible. Obviously, every approach must include rapid, ambitious cuts in carbon emissions by those societies that already enjoy a high enough level of development to provide a decent life for all of their own citizens. Call this ambitious mitigation by economically adequate societies, societies without a large percentage of their members mired in poverty. This would be the leadership on mitigation by the developed that the UNFCCC has required from the beginning. How ambitious this mitigation by the economically adequate needs to be depends on what else we're doing. Speaking very generally, the world must obtain far less energy from carbon-based sources and much more energy from non-carbon-based sources in order not to exceed the carbon budget for a temperature rise of close to 1.5. And this means, as is generally understood, moving rapidly to net zero carbon emissions. The interesting issues arise when we move to the question, where should the new sources of non-carbon-based energy be predominantly located? Inside the countries wealthy enough to fund them themselves? No. The new energy needs to go at least equally to where the eradication of poverty is moving fastest. Many impoverished and deprived human beings are generally deprived, in part because they're energy deprived. If deprivation ought to be eliminated, more energy ought to reach the deprived, and the additional energy will be compatible with not exceeding the carbon budget only to the extent that it's not carbon-based. Additional energy needs to go where the poverty is, not only where the wealth is. This means, among other things, that for nations for whom only carbon-based energy is affordable now, non-carbon-based energy ought to be subsidized as necessary so that their poverty elimination does not worsen climate change. A hopeful sign, of course, is that non-carbon energy has already become more affordable through market processes, but the market responses so far have not been fast enough to prevent many lives from still being lived entirely in abject poverty. Quickly enhancing the trend toward greater affordability of non-carbon energy is essential for development compatible with climate stability. And from the point of view of the rest of us, the well-off, the more of the additional energy for the deprived that remains carbon-based, the more ambitious the reductions in carbon-based energy by us, the affluent, must be for the globe as a whole to meet the same carbon budget. If emissions increase somewhere, they must decrease by more than that amount elsewhere if total emissions are to decline to net zero. New sources of non-carbon energy need to go where the escape from deprivation is escalating in order to minimize increases there in use of carbon energy. So, first, concern for minimizing the deterioration of the climate while continuing to attack poverty requires a prompt energy transition in poorer countries. More non-carbon energy in poor areas serves both the goals. More non-carbon energy in rich areas serves only one, the climate one. The second reason why there must be much more energy from non-carbon-based sources accessible to those who cannot now afford it themselves is less obvious and is deeply political. As climate change progressively worsens, many nations face rising costs in dealing with loss and damage and rising costs for adaptation. This has already been happening for some time. Some nations receive some international assistance for either loss and damage or adaptation, but assistance is meager so far. Each government is primarily responsible for financing any actions required for its own citizens by either loss and damage or adaptation. Any enhancement in poverty elimination is a third source of expense. Meanwhile, fourth, the transition from carbon-based energy to non-carbon-based energy would require additional investments, especially in new energy sources and/or distribution infrastructures. Incorporating the energy transition into development is necessary for a sustainable form of development and is the ideal for the long run. But the energy transition is not needed for less sustainable forms of development. So in the short run, non-sustainable development, for example, building additional coal-burning generating plants for increasing supplies of electricity, may be cheaper than sustainable development. If a nation is sufficiently impoverished, it may not be able to afford all four of these types of expenses: loss and damage, adaptation, basic development, and the energy transition. Experience shows that governments forced to prioritize among these four kinds of expense will rank the energy transition last. And if they can't afford all four, they will neglect the energy transition. Their fundamental reasoning seems to be this: apart from so far relatively inconsequential forms of international assistance, no one else is going to pay very much for our loss and damage, our adaptation, or our development. Since dealing with all three of these is indispensable for providing for the basic needs of our own people, we must prioritize them. If we do not, no one else will. But others may contribute to our energy transition because reductions in our carbon emissions will directly benefit the others too. So contributing to our emission reductions is clearly in their interest to a much greater extent than they think contributing to our other three expenses is. And the poor country leaders are right. It is more obviously in the interest of the wealthier nations to contribute to a more rapid energy transition by the poorer ones, where it's otherwise not going to happen, because everyone needs as rapid reductions as possible in carbon emissions. Many poorer nations cannot spare the resources to pay for the energy transition, and the richer nations can spare the resources. Any contribution by wealthier nations to speeding the energy transition in the poorer nations will qualitatively improve any development that's underway by making it more sustainable. They get development that's more sustainable, and we all get more rapid compliance with a relatively reasonable carbon budget. Conclusion: all nations have a shared interest in making non-carbon-based energy as soon as possible affordable for and accessible to the poor who are escaping poverty. Negative emissions, which have come up quite a bit today. We cannot hold the temperature rise to anywhere near 1.5 without large quantities of negative emissions. If owners of fossil fuels had any commitment to the public interest, they would long ago have invested heavily in research on technologies like CCS in order to begin to reduce the pollution that their own highly profitable products have injected into the atmosphere at everyone else's expense. Instead, they've continued for decades, knowingly and willingly, to undermine the climate with carbon pollution while leaving all the rest of us to deal with it. So, first, the absurdly massive public subsidies for fossil fuels should quickly be eliminated, except in very special cases. Second, in a last appeal to their own narrow interest, governments need to pass carbon taxes or otherwise price their carbon pollution to try to get the owners to respond. But third, and most important, fossil fuel vendors must be forced by law to contribute to negative emissions as long as they continue to do business. They've already established that they will not choose to do so voluntarily. Coalitions of governments, for example, the US, the PRC, and the EU, should explore ways to make carbon fuel marketing in their own societies conditional on some kind of carbon capture. Fuel containing a ton of carbon could be sold only if, say, 2 tons of carbon are very soon verifiably sequestered by some kind of carbon capture technology. This might be implemented through, for example, an initially high supplementary carbon capture tax, the proceeds of which would go into development and dissemination of technologies for capture and removal of carbon, including the demonstration projects that Pete Smith mentioned this morning. And if negative emissions turn out to be impossible or intolerable, as Stefan suggested this morning, the sooner we find out, the better. The capture tax could be reduced later if the technologies are functioning effectively at scale and we still need fossil fuels. It's deeply unfair not to require long-time polluters to clean up a little of their own pollution if they are to continue in business, rather than continuing to allow all environmental costs, including all the costs of climate change, to be generally externalized to everyone, rich and poor, living and yet to be born.